Hello and welcome to this discussion in the Wire. Nirmala Sitharaman presented the union budget yesterday, and like all things Modi government, the yesterday's budget also drew polarizing opinions. While some made it out to be a good budget with relief for the middle classes, some thought that it was a no pain, no gain budget, while some lampooned the government for the massive slash in its social sector spending. So we have with us Associate Professor of Economics at the O.P.Jindal Global University, Deepanshu Mohan, and we'll discuss the budget with him. And he also recently came out with this book, he and Avinav Padmanabhan, called Strongmen Saviors. And it's a comparative study of 4 countries, India, Turkey, Russia and Brazil, and it's a comparative study of political economy of populist leaders. Here, obviously, as we could make out from the book itself, it's about Narendra Modi's rise to power in India, and he has compared him with other leaders, populist leaders of the world. So, we'll discuss about the budget, and we'll also talk about how such strongmen who have emerged as very popular leaders in their respective countries remain in power and continue to do so despite failures on multiple fronts. So, hello Deepanshu, it's very nice having you here at our studio. So, we had the budget yesterday, and I'd like to know what are your initial observations on the budget. Of course, you have written an article yesterday at the Wire,
I know.
but we'd like to kind of unpack it in simple terms.
Yeah. So I see this as a budget which was kept or designed as a no pain, no gain
Yeah, that is what you have
budget,
written. Yeah.
which I mentioned also in the article. Given that most of the measures or interventions made by the finance ministry, it seems, are designed on two basic things. One is that the general expenditure to GDP ratio of the government is now year by year coming down. So we see there is a dwindling effect of the budget. Year on year, government कम पैसा डालना चाह रही है for whether it is social welfare,
Yeah.
whether it is on essential schemes that the government itself was running. And the trade-off that they are compromising this with is by increasing the capital expenditure outlay over from one year to the other, despite knowing the fact that the capital expenditure spending which has been happening has failed so far to crowd in or bring in that much of private investment. So we'll
Yes.
talk about some of these
Yeah.
things. But point is that on the expenditure side, the government is now gradually spending much less than what it was doing across the year. And this brings into the second point, which is that government's general revenue creation powers are being drastically compromised. And my sense is, and for a lot of policy economists, I think it's bizarre to understand why the government has not undertaken measures to increase its direct tax revenue base, when given the massive sense of inequality that we are seeing and the concentration of wealth, which is rightly top for 1%, gives enough leeway and justification for, if not having a long but a temporal surcharge or a cess, to ensure that we have enough revenue margins. It's not just about distributive equity, it's also about creating enough revenue base for expanding. Non-tax revenue disinvestment में आपने देखा ही होगा कि the government year after year is failing to meet its own estimated targets. So this is a budget where I see that the government's ability to do more as part of Modi government's agenda for improving the lives materially and economically of the low middle income group and the low income class has been deeply compromised. That's the way I see it.
Yes, and that is the sense I also got. Generally, a lot of economists have kind of lashed out on this government for massively slashing its social sector spending. So, MG NREGS is down, the health and education budgets are also down. So while many of us were hoping, because in 2024 Narendra Modi will be seeking his third term at the Prime Minister's office. There are three or four major assembly elections this time. So many of us were hoping that this may be a populist budget, given how popular Narendra Modi is in India. So why do you think uh, Narendra Modi would say take a risk of this kind, where people are reeling under inflationary pressures, unemployment, and yet the budget doesn't hold any kind of hold out any kind of confidence for these नीचे के लोग.
जी जी
Yeah.
जी तो तीन तीन चीज़ें हैं आई थिंक थ्री थिंग्स विच आर वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट वन इज दैट द गवर्नमेंट्स as I said, capability and capacity to do more on spending as part of revenue expenditure is no longer, it seems, viable to the extent it was a few years ago. A lot of this has to do with the revenue position, as I just highlighted. The second thing is, and that's more has to do with the political economy of elections right now in India. I don't see the BJP itself at this point of time sees itself in a position where it needs to do far more in terms of spending on essential social security schemes, because it's largely electorally being unchallenged on many critical elections. I'm not saying all elections regionally and state, it's a very different outcome. But at national level, it doesn't see itself as finding any trouble, perceived trouble, with a national opposition, like whether it is Congress or a coalition in making or whatever. So that's the second thing, is a political economy reason. Third is, you might see something happening next year. My sense was, and the pre-budget series of articles which I was writing also is saying that not much may happen on social spending side this time. We would see more on capex, because the government may want to give one more year to see if the private investment can pick up. And if it does pick up on growth, then a lot of things may happen. Now, for the low income group, which you have pointed out, see, this has been consistent from 2014. 2014 onwards, if you see year on year, government has spent very marginally on social welfare schemes which were existing for a very long period of time. They made beach mein this effort to have Ayushman Bharat, PM Kisan, PM Poshan, some of these schemes which were all launched with the effort that, oh, certain targeted groups should get benefit transfers. But my sense is that if you really look at the numbers, the government finds itself in a position right now where it's making a choice between either doing more on the capital expenditure side or on the revenue expenditure side. And it's made a conscious decision. In the pandemic, it didn't do much.
Yes.
So
But ever since Narendra Modi came to power, its focus has been on infrastructure development, ostensibly to entice private investment in India and give employment a boost, domestic demand a boost. But none of those things seems to happen. Seems to have happened over the last 8 years. Private investment has stagnated. Unemployment is at a historic high, and manufacturing sector also, as which is constantly being talked about by this government, isn't exactly picking up, as the data clearly shows that. Yet the Modi government doesn't seem to change tack at all, and it is constantly pushing the same line. Why? What do you think this budget holds out for this line of economic thought?
well, the first thing is, the government has lacked in cohesive economic ideology for implementing a medium to long term vision. As it has a certain very clear political ideology in its sort of decision making apparatus, in its day to day affairs, I think the economic ideology has not been clear. Most economic interventions are largely pro business, as against to what you would consider as, from a quote unquote state which keeps talking about corporates and more investment for the private sector, to be more pro market. The nature of market based reforms have actually not happened to the extent that you would see, which is being done to please the certain class of business community and conglomerates largely. Now, as a one would imagine, as you're rightly pointing out, that the private investment for 9 years would have seen some trend of picking up or revival. And the answer to this somewhere lies that all supply side interventions that the government has made have been based on one big fallacy, which is कोई भी policy economist आपको बोलेगा, basics of Keynesian economics will tell that aggregate demand in India for the low middle income group and the low income class has not been picking up
Yes,
for a very long period of time.
there is hardly any domestic demand. Only if people save substantially, they'll spend more.
Absolutely.
And if they don't spend at all in the current state of like inflation, unemployment, any kind of substantial savings, so they won't go and buy things from the market. And in given this scenario, why does the government expect the private sector to invest more?
Well, so that's why I said the economic ideology has to be understood. If the conversation were to be happening between people who are taking those decisions, I think a lot of things would become clear, but that never happens. So we really don't know what goes. I mean, to me, it's a combination of intellectual bankruptcy and also at the same time a lack of feedback system within the government to advise that private sector with 75% capacity is unwilling to invest in many sectors. I think the first big series of shocks was 2016, demonetization, GST. The failure of the effective implementation of IBC has made the banking sector even more reluctant to be as open as possible. But in spaces like in private banking, जहाँ room है credit growth को expand करने का, the private sector is happy to sit on enough liquidity as much as possible to maximize on that. And somewhere you also understand, I mean, if you look at the corporate perspective here, you also understand the corporate sector that in the environment of global investment uncertainty right now, sitting on more liquidity is not quote unquote a bad business strategy. There are certain areas where the private sector will just not go in. So आपने PM आवास योजना का देखा होगा कि allocation substantially बढ़ गया है. I think that's a positive welcome step.
Welcome step, yes.
Now, why did it take, since PM Awas Yojana started, a significant period of time for this allocation to, I mean, that's the thing which you see with the government. Suddenly, 1 year they'll make an allocation which is 44% of a year high. Then in the next 2 years or 3 years, you'll see that the allocation will go down. For any ministry to allocate that amount of money to implement and see that structural transformation, you need sustained amount of investment and spending.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the other things which we have to be mindful of. Yeah.
So yes, I get your point, but let me come back to a crucial distinction between distinction that you made in your previous answer is you see the Modi government as pro-business. So would it be fair to say that the previous governments, say for example the Congress governments the UPA governments were pro-markets, the distinction that you made, and Narendra Modi as a pro-business kind of a government?
I think there will have to be a little careful. There was evidence in UPA 1 of pro-market measures being taken to bring a series of investment proposals and forms in telecom, aviation, many sectors, and you saw the effect of it. One very good way to understand
the constant the growth rate was kind of substantial throughout the UPA regime.
Yes. UPA 2 post 2011, if you see the numbers, and it says from growth, private investment in India started almost stagnating from somewhere around 2012, 2013 level. Good indicator, what we generally call gross fixed capital formation, GFCF, started sort of stagnating around that period of time. It happened a couple of years before Modi came to power. The idea was that one of the biggest reasons holding back investment was a strong political mandate, which with Modi coming into power was expected that will be taken care of. And the first 2 years, you do see with FDI levels, foreign direct investment in India had picked up. But domestic private investment post 2016 and FDI also has not seen at any level before that. Now, with previous regimes, the point you made, I think there is evidence that reforms were made in the hope of allowing investment in certain open sectors. And I think the returns for those were being seen with 2000, and if I were to say 2003, 2011, which is perhaps the best year in India's post-independent history on growth, performance, investment. Almost all indicators are doing well. You have to see that what was happening around that period of time, and it's a combination of both. Atal Bihari Vajpayee's government at that period of time, which involved private disinvestment in many sectors, and also positive spillover of what Manmohan Singh was doing around the first UPA one regime. So I think politically अगर हम इसको देखें, I think एक period of time है जहाँ private investment इंडिया में पिकअप किया था, बिकॉज जनरली एक अपवर्ड मोबिलिटी देखी गई थी मिडिल क्लासेस में भी, हम लोग के अंदर भी एक एस्पिरेशनल स्ट्रक्चर बना हुआ था, लुकिंग एट probability of more investment opportunities across sectors. But that was for a temporal period of time in that decade. I think post that we've not really seen that kind of effect.
Why post 2016? What happened? Do you kind of blame uncertain and sudden measures like demonetization, flawed implementation of GST that is creating an environment of uncertainty within the private businesses and private sector?
My sense is there are three things in this. One is there is a lack of an economic ideological base which is being reflected on the government's part that the private sector is not able to clearly grasp. Nobody would invest big money, long-term capital, unless they know that a lot of the money is secured on the promises that you have from the government, which is to say that there has to be clarity in the policy making prism. There is ad hocism which has been now institutionalized to a level that's very difficult for private investment.
Any
also
serious business house to
So what is the evidence of this, of my task? You look at foreign portfolio investment in India. Foreign portfolio investment has been very high. What we call generally as hot money. It comes in, close out very quickly. So Adani's performance is bad right now. A lot of money investors will pull out their money and that money can go out. Sustained investment requires that level of clarity in policy making prism. That I think sustained clarity has not been established, and the reason for that is we don't have a clear economic ideological prism established within the government. Demonetization, GST, a lot of those things were part of explaining that sort of mindset. The second point is to be
these two measures particularly hurt the informal sector quite a bit.
Absolutely. Now Now I was coming to the second point. Now, second point is you also see that a lot of the efforts were being made in the manufacturing sector, the MSME sector, where if you really see that the level of demand, consumption demand, and the performance of these segments have been doing bad for a considerably long period of time. India lost out on the manufacturing advantage as a nation state, I think, for a good decade ago. Now what is providing in terms of exports are largely goods which are in certain regional markets, but it can never be that big manufacturing powerhouse like a China or a Bangladesh or a Vietnam, because that pivoting of policy towards manufacturing didn't happen early enough. Our cost advantages are not in manufacturing to that extent as they are maybe in service sector, as Raghuram Rajan and a lot of others have pointed out. So those are two very, I think, important points. If you allow me, the final point which is important for private investment not picking up is also about a lack of, and this has to do with the socio-political landscape. There is a lack of social cohesion. A point which Kaushik Basu and many others have made so far is that when there is lack of social cohesion, investment and growth always suffers. You can pick examples from so many countries, whether it is Turkey, Brazil, Russia, wherever you had a strongman, populist, authoritarian figure coming into power and undertaking certain centralization of power related measures, you will find that majoritarian consensus breaking social cohesion has had a negative impact on both growth and private investment.
So which brings me to the question, of course you have written this book, Strongman Saviors, and I would highly recommend this to our viewers. It's a comparative study of India, Turkey, Russia, Brazil, all of which have strongmen as their heads, and all of them are populist leaders. So which is kind of making me a little confusing. All these leaders, Narendra Modi, Erdogan, Putin, or i- in fact Bolsonaro, who recently lost. But are these people, they're so popular, they're still not being able to manage the economy well, and yet they have won successive terms. So, what is it? Has economy and economic concerns ceased to remain as political concerns of people or even electoral concerns?
I think the response to that, and
Because India also has such high degree of unemployment. Everything and people's savings are going down. There's so much of price rise. People are struggling to buy even essential commodities, and yet we don't see anything of these concerns sticking to Narendra Modi and his government. What is it that makes these leaders so
so
immune to these kind of economic
yeah,
trends?
no, with the Indian case, it's a little peculiar, and as you've been documenting and looking at analyzing elections, you know that the local dynamic, inflation, unemployment, a lot of those factors do make a role in effect.
Yes.
I think UP elections was a very case different apart from that respect, but there is some degree of discontentment which is articulated. National level पे वो चीज़ क्यों नहीं हो रही है उसका you have to see the answer to that with the nature of opposition politics and many other factors, that whether the opposition is doing a good job in highlighting some of the issues which makes people more worried. But one of the factors which has worked in the favor of all of these leaders, which we argue in the book, is connected with two things. One is the rise in religious conservatism that has happened across all the case studies you were looking at, where whether you look at the orthodoxy in and the church-state relationship in Russia, the same scenario in Brazil under Bolsonaro during the time he was in power, and between Orthodox Islam and the effort by Erdogan to bring those measures at the level of widespread mainstream politics, and in India's case with the rise of Hindutva. I mean, all of the cases give a perspective that majoritarian consensus and a narrative of the majority feeling threatened or a victimhood being instilled makes each of one of them to be projected, rhetorically speaking, as the voice of the majority. And a lot of times that narrative is pushed as far as possible to counter the existing status quo of the elite, whether it's the political elite or business elite. In fact, under Modi, you see the conceptualization of the elite has been over a period of time being changed. The new political elite or the new business elite is very different from what it was under the Congress, and there is an effort to change that, reimagine that narrative politically as well. You see that with history writing and history reimagination. You see that with what's happening in Bollywood, right? For example, in popular culture and cinema. So a lot is being made as an effort to change the narrative or the rhetoric around how this one person is seen as an answer of all troubles, and at the same time is the main counteracting or countervailing force to any other possible alternative that can come in power.
Yes.
And this us versus them वाला जो एक ideological factor है जो एक axis में help करता है,
Binary, yes.
those binaries really help in getting one person. So Indian elections got presidential with Narendra Modi, of course, but does he have that kind of a face, right, to be counteract against it? And in some cases, you have to ask the question whether at a period of time, like Russia's case was very different. And we've argued it in the book that there are three broader factors of corruption, experiments with neoliberalism or what you consider as supply side economics, and to a certain extent, rise in religious conservatism, all factors that led to the rise of each of these leaders in power. Because they were seen as leaders who were not part of the quote-unquote prevailing establishment.
Yeah.
They were seen as outsiders who were coming with an agenda of development. Bolsonaro's campaign was also
At a
on
time
development.
like when people were seemingly losing their trust on the political
Absolutely.
class. Yes.
So Bolsonaro was coming with the development objective. to mobilize the migrant workers and communities which did not have quote unquote a voice. Modi was talking about
So, but
Vikas.
will 8 years down the line, will it be kind of fair to say that Modi came not just as a Hindu Hriday Samrat, but also as a development icon back in 2014?
Absolutely.
8 years down the line, do you see him as only a person who can enthuse and kind of invoke emotive issues within the majoritarian community or a large section of Hindu population,
Absolutely.
and has kept like kind of kept aside his development or economic
Absolutely. I think, and that's
analysis?
the failure of being able to not do that is hitting the BJP hard, especially in second term. I think as soon as the move towards CA, NRC, a lot of the narrative started changing, and then the pandemic happened. Many of what the measures the government has taken has completely taken that upward mobility, development focus, education pay, employment pay. Most of those things were being seen as factors that could see a revival as an effort. And as you pointed out at the beginning of the interview, that with the budget as well, each of these areas, like there is no mention of unemployment.
Yes.
For 4 consecutive years, the finance minister and the prime minister has not acknowledged there's an employment crisis. फिर आप नौकरी मेला क्यों कर रहे हैं?
No, there's a certain degree of impunity with which this government works, and kind of is kind of very comforted by the fact that no one can, his government, the government, can evade accountability like anything. For example, yesterday I was looking at a few of the opposition reactions. Most of them pointed out that last year's 2022 and 2023, the budgetary outlay, whatever was allocated in the budget document, most of the social sector spending wasn't even like kind of the revised estimates were lower than the budgetary estimates, which is kind of very rare in any developing nation. Generally, we see that the budgetary allocations, the revised estimates are greater than what was allocated initially. But here in every small scheme you see, so Jairam Ramesh, the Congress spokesperson, termed as the OPUD strategy of the Modi government, which is over promise and under deliver. Yet, do you think these kind of factors will stick against the Modi?
You've provided the evidence for what I was saying, that the revenue capacity and the capability of the government is at such suboptimal level at this point of time, that my sense is that their only message is you borrow and spend. The message they've sent to state, they're now asking the Food Corporation of India, FCI, the way the jugglery really happens in the accounting measures is they're saying we have to stick to fiscal consolidation. So they're asking now FCI to borrow for the food subsidies that it has to give.
The food subsidy has been cut down by one third.
Yes, already. And then it is asking the particular corporation to borrow. So my sense is we are in a sticky spot when it comes to macro and microeconomic indicators.
Yes.
Inflation, high unemployment, these are 2 factors that have brought down all populist authoritarian figures across the world.
But yet Modi's has decided to continue with his free ration program to 80 crores people, has increased the PM Awas Yojana, increase the spending on PM Awas Yojana. That these are of course election year, is an election year and is most likely to be implemented well. So do you think that all the larger concerns of the economy will be offset by these kind of 2 welfare?
No, I think there we're looking at 2 questions. Whether the fact that he's likely to come back in power, my sense is yes, 2024, that's what it all looks like. But if you're asking the larger question, the third term is the weakest in the Indian context of any quote unquote strong man or strong woman syndrome. Indira Gandhi's third term was her weakest, Nehru's third term was his weakest. My sense is the same will happen with Modi because the economy will leave the ship aside. My sense is that India is going to struggle seriously if it's not able to revive private investment across sectors.
You think economy will continue as one of the prime primary political factors also.
That's my
Because
sense. I think even yeah.
India has been slipping into over the last 8 years, slipping into more and more into the well of identity
I think
politics, different kinds of identity politics, which has kind of overshadowed all economic concerns.
I
And
think
Modi is kind of Modi and BJP,
yeah,
and not just BJP, but other parties also. They are also kind of giving primacy to those kind of
absolutely.
identity driven factors
Yeah.
more than any livelihood or economic
Yeah,
issues.
no, I can look more from the economics perspective only for the sense that it is a big factor. It is not as if that it is going to lose importance. It will gain more prominence, I'm saying, because you see with UP, for example, what Adityanath now is trying to do, most of the success of a government's policy making prism is being evaluated from its ability to bring more investment, more development, more logistical network, more highways, more ports. So on highways, ports, a lot of things have happened positively under the government. We are asked to look at it. Look at the Northeast, a lot of the connectivity is improved. Those are things which one has to acknowledge. Having said that, one of the things which I feel is a serious misgiving is of the fact that because the government doesn't have a clear, cohesive economic ideology in mind, we don't know, and the private sector doesn't know, or the public sector doesn't know, the bureaucracy doesn't know how the next 3 or 5 years the handling of the economy would happen. At the same time, one of this thing is very peculiar about India. I think the only other example you can think is Brazil for that matter, is the level of informality in India so high that has also increased that level of resilience. If the government is not doing its bit, many people, like you saw with the migrant workers leaving cities, will establish themselves in doing what they can close to home, their own form of self-employed work. And that to a certain extent takes, with a state abdicating its own responsibility, a lot of times people start saying that सरकार इसमें क्या ही कर लेगी, right? हमको अपनी जिम्मेदारी खुद देखनी है. And a lot of times that fills well with the rhetoric of what the government is trying to do. But it's not a sustainable strategy. It might help you in a temporal, short term manner, but people will ask the tough questions. You saw with the Agnipath scheme, many youngsters had protested against what's happening in the army. Railway, you see the outlay that has gone up because there is a lot of angst. A lot of subcontractualization in work has not really helped in giving more employment and jobs. So it's not as if that somewhere at the underneath the government is not cognizant of this. My sense is it is, but it should be more targeted towards job creation. Should have a very clear fiscal roadmap, 3 to 5 years. I think accountability on not just numbers, but also on vision has to be very clearly assessed and drawn out. I think otherwise, beyond that, which if it doesn't happen, you'll find a huge change in power shift post 2024. I think that's my sense. But 2024 seems settled as of now.
Yeah. So I think we'll leave it at that, Deepanshu. So that's all for now. And as Deepanshu said, that the government may be lacking a clear economic orientation or even a precise economic ideology that caters to the needs of the majority of people. 2023 and 2024 are so-called election years, and we will see whether these failures on the economic front will affect Modi or not, or will his majoritarian politics, his social agenda continue to hold sway over people. That's all for now. This is Ajoy Ashirwad signing off. Thank you.